David Green from the Sociology Department here at John Jay College, and I'm sitting here with Michael Tonry. Michael, in what ways is the United States an international outlier among Western countries when it comes to matters of crime and punishment? And also, in what ways is it not an outlier?
So one fundamental difference is the order of magnitude with which American jurisdictions punish its residents. The numbers are awful in a setting like this, but I'll use some. So the United States imprisons 700 per 100,000 of its population. The norm in those countries with which we would ordinarily compare ourselves in Western Europe and the other English-speaking countries is 100 or 110, about a seventh. In other countries to which many aspirationally would compare ourselves, the Swiss or the Scandinavians, it's a 10 to 1 difference. Their rates are about 70. That order of magnitude is a fundamental difference. A fundamental difference that gets paid much less attention is that we convict people of crimes and send them to prison on much flimsier bases than do legal systems of any other country. As anyone who's worked in the criminal justice system knows, 90 to 95% of criminal convictions in the U.S. result from guilty pleas, most of those induced by prosecutors offering limited concessions to offenders, with no validation ever by a judge or any other institution of the appropriateness of the conviction or the disposition. As a federal circuit court, a Second Circuit Court of Appeals judge here in New York, Gerald Lynch, has pointed out, in the federal courts in the U.S. and to a growing extent in the state courts, prosecutors not only decide whether someone should be convicted, but what sentence they should receive. Lynch bluntly says, in most cases, the judge has nothing to do with it. That is not, there's no other English-speaking or Western European country in which that's true. In many Western European countries and some English-speaking countries, prosecutors may not even make a recommendation to the judge as to what the sentence ought to be because of a notion that the imposition of sentencing is an inherently judicial operation. It requires dispassion and balance and reflection. In the U.S., we have an assembly of the line system of justice. So those seem to me the two most radical and fundamental differences between the U.S. and most other Western countries.
Why is the U.S. such a distinct jurisdiction in this way?
No one has an authoritative answer for that. I think part of the answer is the history of American race relations. There's no, it seems to me, coincidence that roughly half the people in American prisons are black. 2/3 are members of minority groups. The policies that send people to prison either involve drugs, but particularly crack cocaine in our time, or violence, both of which, for very different reasons, are offenses for which black and to a lesser extent Hispanic people are much more likely to be convicted and sent to prison. I think that's a major driver. A second driver, though, is a fundamental shift, I think, in American political and social culture. Beginning in the 1970s, policymakers and even to a considerable extent practitioners involved in handling individual cases stopped empathizing with the troubled human beings who come before criminal courts charged with crimes. I think before 1970, under a different system that was called indeterminate sentencing, judges and prosecutors imperfectly and sometimes not at all, but nonetheless prosecutors and judges typically thought a lot about the human being who was before them and tried to fashion their decisions about handling that human being's life in a way that took account in some sympathetic way of that person and the life they had lived. That disappeared. Not entirely, of course you don't want to overgeneralize, but at a policy-making level, it disappeared. I mean, how, for example, could New York legislators have decided that any 16-year-old charged with street robbery will be sentenced in an adult felony court, processed in an adult felony court, and maybe sent to state prison? How could legislators all across the country have decided that serious crimes by 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds could be punished with sentences of life without the possibility of parole. How could legislators have decided that 15, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old disadvantaged kids were growing up in socially disorganized neighborhoods who stupidly or greedily sold 2 or 3 grams or 5 grams of crack cocaine could spend the next 20 years of their lives in prison? It's because, I think, something happened in our political culture that made policymakers and often the practitioners who enforce these laws stop thinking about the individual human beings who were affected by them.
There's a lot of talk about reform of mass incarceration, and you've written in the past that those debates need to be framed in more than instrumental terms, that framing things in terms of recidivism reduction or public safety are just not going to get us there. Your argument has been that we need to have a moral argument and an argument about values.
Sure.
And I'm wondering how you think that might be possible to do. What is the strategy to make that happen?
I think I'll answer your question, but I think it's the wrong question. Because the question, as I understand it, asks, all right, as a strategic matter, how can we persuade people to take account of the kinds of arguments we want to make in order to achieve the kinds of ends we want to achieve? As if it's, what's the trick here? I think it's not a trick. I think many of the laws we have, which have, to me, the horrible properties that I described, were enacted by people who believed one of several things to be true. They believed that if we impose remarkably harsh punishments, it'll make a better world. Right? They believed the interests of offenders don't matter. Or they believed we've got to emphasize the interests of victims and vindicate victims. That's what's important to do. I don't think those laws were enacted because legislators did cost-benefit analyses or put together or read meta-analyses and decided that this was the practical, most effective way to accomplish an end. So now, for people who want to change what's happening, to say, well, it's cost too much, or we can save a bit of money, or we can reduce recidivism a little if we do A instead of B, I don't think that's going to result in fundamental change. What I think will result in fundamental change when other people are able to hear it and listen to it, which they have not been until possibly the last few years, is when we say it is wrong to take a young person's life away from him or her. We have lots of evidence from other countries in which the maximum sentence for anything is 10 or 15 or 20 years, that in most Western countries there are understandings of limits of what you do to individual human lives that don't exist now. I think the argument's got to be made, it is just profoundly unjust. Probably it's immoral to take away the lives of 15-year-olds, period. European courts have no trouble at all striking down the few efforts by European parliaments to enact laws like this by simply saying, as the Germans did, well, you can't have a real life sentence. There has to be a meaningful opportunity for offenders to raise the question of whether any valid social purpose can be achieved by holding them longer, and there has to be a realistic possibility that they will be released. And why is that? Because they are possessed of human dignity, and part of the possession of human dignity includes the possibility to imagine living a better life. If you say to a 45-year-old or a 20-year-old or a 13-year-old that you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, there is no possibility of imagining living a better life.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.